we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon to all of you. It's so exciting to get to be with you again. So today we are digging into Chasidut. We're going to be looking at several different Hasidic thinkers, specifically on the topic of revelation, on the revelation of God revealing God's self to Moshe, and also of the revelation, the giving over of the Torah. Before we dig into the text, I want to talk a little bit about what is Chasidut, what characterizes Chasidut, what should we be looking for when we're reading these texts. So Chasidut, really the person who is thought to be the founder of Chasidut is the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov quite literally means the sort of the owner or the one with the great name. And the Baal Shem Tov, he was Polish, and he was born around in the 1730s. The Baal Shem Tov is really a mythical figure, sort of one in which there's a lot of stories and legends that surround him that we're not even sure exactly when he was born. We don't know exactly when he died. They're all sort of like different stories and myths around the Baal Shem Tov. But the Baal Shem Tov did something really radical at his time that really became the basis for Hasidut. He suggested that the way to God was not through scholarship, was not through necessarily advanced learning. It was not through text. It was not even necessarily through prayer that was rooted in saying a lot of different words and fixed liturgy, but that rather the way to God could be something that the way to God really just required a pure and simple heart and a desire to be with God, that there was a simplicity to it, and that anyone could really access God anywhere, anytime, regardless of their experience, regardless of their level of knowledge, regardless of their sort of like Jewish sophistication. And so at a time in which there was this continued emphasis on more and more time spent in the yeshiva, spent in these sort of house of learnings and studying and sort of deeper and deeper knowledge of Talmud and deeper sophistication of prayer that, you know, that there, I'm sure some of you have experienced in your lives, there can be quite a high, thank you, I will speak a little bit slower. Thank you to someone who put that note in the chat. It's always good to remind me to speak slower. That there can be a number of barriers to Jewish life, a number of barriers to accessing God. And a lot of those, you know, part of this course, the Jewish bookshelf, is sort of naming the fact that we have so many Jewish books on our bookshelves. We can be overwhelmed by the amount of text that we have. And the Baal Shem Tov was saying, actually, there's a sense in which we don't need all of that. He wasn't saying that wasn't good and really important and really holy, but he was saying at the end of the day, the way to God is not going to be through text, and it's not going to be through someone else's fixed liturgy. It's going to be opening up your heart and turning to God. And that idea, as simple and sort of pure as it was, angered a lot of people. And there was a lot of whiplash against the Baal Shem Tov, because he was challenging a lot of norms that he was saying that you don't have to spend years and years and years studying Talmud, that even the unlearned sort of peasant farmer can access God in the same way that the scholar can. I want to share just a few basic principles that are sort of common to Hasidic writers and Hasidic thinkers. One is that we see as a through line in Hasidic text is a desire to cleave to God. So cleaving is sort of a very specific type of word. A dvekut is the word in Hebrew. A cleaving is like a desire and longing and yearning to attach oneself to God, to attain that sort of close intimacy with God. Is one idea of like, how can we do that, you know, in all of our actions, in all of our thoughts, how can we attain that state of dvekut, of that cleaving to God? A second thing that we see that's really characteristic is the focus on kavanah, the focus on intention. The word there is kavanah, is intention. And again, it's sort of a stripping away of the focus on language, a stripping away of you know, even just going about following halakha, following Jewish law by rote. He wasn't saying that mitzvot and halakha weren't important, but he was saying this sort of following it by rote, that's not the path to God. The path to God is having a pureness of heart and an intention to sort of be with God, to serve God. And that is just as important, if not more important, than the following of the mitzvot. That you can't, there could be sometimes in Judaism the tendency to divorce mitzvot, the performance of mitzvot and actions, from the intentions. And part of what we see in Chasidut is that the intentions, the purity with which we do things, is really important as actions, if not more important. There's also, in Chasidut, we see a lot of focus on the anti-ascetic, being against things like, there are in moments in Jewish history, there were some moments about, even within the Hasidic world, really, there were some people sort of who were pushing towards depriving oneself for the sake of God, or depriving oneself for the sake of learning, to be so one-tracked, focused, to be fasting, or to, just for the sake of sort of only studying, 18 hours a day, and that most Hasidic thinkers are actually really against that, and against that aesthetic life, and that actually a lot of what Chasidut is doing is it's raising up joy, it's raising up ecstasy, it's raising up bodily experiences and being in our body, and really that Chasidut is supposed to be a celebration of life and not a deprivation of life, supposedly in the name of our relationship to God. Something else that we see, and this was something that was challenged and was a bit controversial, is the idea that God is in everything, that there's a spark of God that is in everything and everyone, which sounds good, but in Hasidic writers, they would extend it and say, and that if you take that seriously, that God is in everything and in anyone, it also means that there's a spark of God potentially in evil. And so that's a little bit difficult and hard to understand. What does that mean, that there could be a spark of God in evil? But that idea of the oneness of God, that God is in everything, and that even both in the good and evil, is something that we see also in Hasidic thought. And one of the last things I want to emphasize is also in the Hasidic world, it's very much focused on the role of the tzaddik, the role of the righteous person, the role of the Rebbe, who is the Rebbe, and people look to them and they have their followers, that there's a lot of different Hasidic branches within sort of the world of Chasidut, and that each have their own Rebbe that people follow and turn to and cleave to. And the idea being that maybe we might not be able to get to that place of spiritual elevation on our own, but we need leaders and people that we turn to, and they show us the way. And by surrounding, I think another way to say this is by surrounding ourselves with people that inspire us and motivate us to do good, by following the example of the Rebbe, assuming the Rebbe is setting a good example, the Rebbe will help pull us along to that path. And sort of the last thing I'll just say, which I've said a bit already, that I think is like really the through line of Hasidut, is just this idea, the opportunity in Hasidut, that we can cling to God, that we can show devotion to God in everything that we do. That it's not just about learning Torah or praying to God, but that actually, like, the real chassid, the real, righteous person in this way, there's a way in which they can show devotion to God in the manner in which they tie their shoelaces, or the way in which they feed their children, or the way in which they wash the dishes late at night because they're letting their partner rest on the couch, whatever it is. That there could be opportunities for connecting with God, opportunities for devotion in everything that we do, that everything is an opportunity, that every moment, that there's a sense in which there is nothing that is mundane. If everything contains the holy spark, and everyone contains the holy spark, then how does that transform the way we relate to each other, if each of us contain this holy spark? And if every action, if every object contains a holy spark, how does that transform the way we relate to our actions of our lives? That there is no action that is then mundane or for the sake of passing time or something that we are doing by rote, but every action has the potential to become elevated. And Rabbi Arthur Green, he would classify himself as a neo-Hasidic, so sort of being a next generation of Hasidic scholars that's interested both in the sort of the foundation of Hasidut, but with a modern sort of understanding of it. Rabbi Arthur Green, he's the rector at Hebrew College, which is the rabbinical school where I was ordained. He has a book called, what is it called? Radical Thinking or something like that. I'll look up the title for you. Radical something. And he says, everything that exists in the world, spiritual and physical, is God himself. It's just like a lot to take in. That's very Hasidic. Everything that exists in the world, spiritual and physical, is God himself. These things are true without a doubt. Because of this, every person can become attached to God wherever he is, throughout the holiness that exists in every single thing, even corporal things. So again, I think that idea is really fundamental. Every person can become attached to God, and wherever you are. Radical Judaism. Thank you so much. Yeah, the title of Art's book is Radical Judaism. Makes sense. Because it is radical in a sense. It's a radical idea that anyone can become attached to God wherever they are, and that there's also this sense of embodiment, both of elevating our own bodies, and also that holiness exists in everything, even in physical objects. This is the foundation of all the mystical formulations. So that was all just quoting Rabbi Arthur Green. Okay, so that was a lot by way of intro to Chasidut. And again, I just would leave you, as we're gonna start looking at the text on Revelation. But as we're turning to the text, we want to ask ourselves a couple of questions. What are these texts teaching us about Revelation? What is Hasidic about these texts? And also, if we really are to take seriously that every person can become attached to God wherever they are through everything, how would that transform the way we live? How would that transform our daily interactions? How would that transform the act of washing the dishes? How would that transform the act of getting in our car and driving somewhere? That it's not just that the opportunities for connection to God are only accessible to an elite few who have access to a high level of Torah learning, but it's accessible to everyone at all times, in all moments. Okay, I'll take a moment just to see if there are questions on that. I saw a couple of things in the chat. Oh, Rochelle, so that's really interesting. If the sacred is in everything, why the emphasis in Judaism? Why the emphasis in Judaism towards separation? So I think there's a couple of ways. I would love for you to say more about your question. I think there's a couple of ways I could understand your question. I think that you're right that there is a sense. There's the sense of potentially the sense of separation that could be in the Jews being a separate people from other people. That's one of the ways in which we hear separation. Even in the language of the Torah blessings that God shows us, there's a sense of separating us. There's also could be the sense of separation in terms of a lot of what Jewish thinking is actually separation between moments, separating the holy from the not holy, separating one moment from the next moment, separating Shabbat from the rest of the days of the week. I'll say in terms of the first point, if you were thinking about separation in terms of separating the Jews from people, I think there's a lot of tension. That's a good question, and there's not an easy answer. I think that for some, there is an emphasis on separating out the Jews. And I think there are a lot of other Jewish thinkers who would say, no, my idea of Judaism is actually a oneness with all things and a oneness with all people. Certainly Rabbi Arthur Green sort of has an idea and conception of God that's about bringing all of us together, recognizing the God in all of humanity and not separating out the Jews. So I think that depends who we're talking about. That's a really complicated and nuanced question. And in terms of Judaism, definitely has an emphasis on separating even the language of Havdalah when we're ending Shabbat on Saturday night, lehavdil ben kodesh lechol, to separate, to distinguish between the holy and the not holy. Yeah, it's sort of both and, I think. I mean, I love Judaism's emphasis. The point of why Judaism is emphasizing separateness is to elevate. Yeah, okay, so Rochelle, you are saying that. No, separation of the holy from the profane. What is kosher and what is treif, like that. Even needing to separate men from women in the physical shul. Yeah, that is a bit of a conundrum. Right, so I think that goes to what I want to say. It's a really interesting question. I think I want to say it's both and, that I think the way I normally understand the separation is that we want to separate to create distinctions, because the human tendency is not to distinguish between things and let things sort of be this unmarked, unpassed, nothing is holy. And so because our default is sort of like, it's all part of the same, we just eat food and we eat and we don't pay attention to it. We sort of consume time and we don't distinguish between one day of the next. And so Judaism is helping us with that, knows that we're just going to be sort of like consumers in the sense, not distinguishing from one moment to another. And so Judaism is forcing us to separate in order to raise up, this is a holy food, this is a holy moment, this is a holy time. I think that the ideal, what you're pushing me to think, is that the ideal would be is if we could live in this heightened Hasidic state of suspension where there are no distinctions and that everything is holy. I think the reality is that none of us live in that world. Probably even the Hasidic thinkers might not even live in that world. That it's really hard to sustain. It's it's powerful to think about holiness being in everything and the opportunity for every moment to be a holy encounter. The reality is that we can't actually sustain that level of heightened holiness. And so we live down here all the time. And so then Judaism, I think, is forcing us to separate in order to at least raise up some moments. But you're right. I think that's a really interesting question, that there is a real tension, that maybe in the ideal, we wouldn't separate, but then I think it would all just fall flat for us. We would lose that sense of, as someone else wrote, one of the first comments was that there's holiness in separation. Even the language of to offer an offering in Hekdesh, an offering that was offered to the temple is called Hekdesh, which is meaning Hekdesh from the word Kodesh, that it's sanctified. And when it becomes sanctified, it becomes separated, that the act of separating something out is in effect an act of sanctifying it. Those are good questions. Okay. I like, Lindy, what you're saying here, raise the mundane to the holy. I think that's a beautiful way of saying it. And Monty says, God calls for separation by people to show commitment to God, following rules as a part of covenant. Yeah. Okay, good. So with that, let's actually dive into some of the text here. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Make it a bit bigger. So we're actually going to skip the first text on the source sheet, but we'll probably come back to that perhaps next week. We're going to start I thought we were going to start that first text is the actual, the moment of revelation where God is revealing the Torah of the 10 Commandments and thunder on Mount Sinai. But I want to go back even to an earlier revelation, an earlier moment of revelation. That moment, that first text is communal revelation of God revealing God's self to all of the community and giving over the Torah. Sort of the first revelation of God, in a sense, is God revealing God's self to Moshe in the burning bush, that Moshe is out wandering, tending his flock, and Moshe sees the burning bush, and Moshe stops and looks at the burning bush, and God calls to Moshe, and Moshe says, Hineni, here I am, and Moshe approaches the bush. And so then this is what happens. Moshe says to God, and of course what happens when Moshe approaches the bush is that God says, hi, I'm God. You're going to go and bring my people out of slavery in Egypt. Go and get my people. Go and tell Pharaoh that you're taking my people out. And Moshe, of course, has some questions about this mission that he's being sent on. So Moshe says to God, when I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is God's name? What shall I say to them? Sort of a fair question that Moshe says, if you want me to go and bring these people out, these people are going to have questions, like the first of which might be, who is this God? How do we call this God? How can we be in relationship with God? One of the ways that what's the first thing you do when you meet someone? You say, what's your name, right? Like it's very difficult to be in relationship with someone if we don't know their name. So if Moshe is supposed to bring the people out and bring them into relationship with God, they're going to want to know who you are. What's your name? And God, Vayomer Elohim el Moshe, God says to Moshe, Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh. I will be that which I will be. I don't know if this was the name that Moshe was expecting God to give him. Moshe asked for a name, and God's answer is Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh. I will be what I will be. God continued, thus say to the Israelites, Ehiyeh shilachani aleichem. Ehiyeh, I will be, sent me to you. And God said further to Moses, thus shall you speak to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever. This, my appellation for all eternity. Okay, so I want to take a minute through the chat. When God says to Moshe, Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh, this is my name, I will be that which I will be. How do you understand that? What does that mean? What does that mean to have a God whose God revealed, the name that God gives for God's self is, I will be what I will be. Say to the Israelites, Ehiyeh sent me to you. I will be sent me to you. What does that mean for us? So Julie says God as being. I wonder if you want to say more about that, Julie. It makes me think some people talk about God. Sometimes we think about God as a noun, but that God is actually a verb or God is actually an action. My mom says, my name is not of importance. I can be many different things. I love that. That's very interesting. So that's sort of a pushback on what I was saying. The human tendency is the way that I can be in relationship is through name. Tell me your name. That's the most important piece of information. And what my mom is saying is, at least with God, that God is saying, that's not the information you need about me. My name is irrelevant. You don't need my name. I can be many things. I can contain many things. It's interesting to think if is that only true for God, or if that might also be true for us, the ways in which we like limit ourselves, we are forced to pinpoint ourselves to be one thing, but that actually, like the language of Walt Whitman, that each one of us contain multitudes. And so too, God is saying, I contain multitudes. I'm not one thing. I love that God is saying, you don't need to know my name. That's not the way to know me. It's also an interesting question. If we were trying to get to know someone, if the name is not the real way to know someone, what is the way to know someone? What would be the information? What should Moshe have asked God? That God could have said, this is the information you need. So Shalom and Dahlia say that I am always changing. Love that. So that God is saying, the thing that God's name reveals is that God is in constant change, in constant motion. And again, I wonder, what might that reveal about us? If God is constantly changing, are we also constantly changing? Good. So Ria also says that I have no static identity. It's very powerful. I wonder what that means, to be in relationship with a God that is constantly changing and has no static identity. I wonder if you find that comforting or scary or exciting. Do we want a God that is constantly changing? Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh. Julian says, God is our personal God. His name is what he means to each of us. Oh, I love that. So ehiyeh asher ehiyeh, I will be what I will be, is I will be what I will be to each person. There's a sense in which feels very Hasidic, that we each have a unique and special relationship to God, and that part of what revelation might be is each of us discovering God. Ehiyeh, the sense in which God is changing, is that God is changing and revealed uniquely to each person. That's a beautiful idea. Faith says the Kabbalists say Ein Sof. So Ein Sof there is the one without end, which in a sense does go sort of with Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh. I will be that which I will be. And there's a sense in which there's this constant changing, that there's no end to God. Rita says, it differentiates God from the idols people were worshiping. Rita, I wonder what you mean by that, but it does make me think that idols, I feel like, are by definition, there are these solid objects that are static, that you can see, that don't change, whereas God is this continual revelation, this continual changing, something that we can't even physically, is not only we can't grasp with our hands, but is continually changing. Martin says, I was what I was and will be what I will be. So again, that sense of changing, it's interesting, Martin, because you're also bringing in the past of it, which is good because that connects to the next verse. That on one hand, God says the future tense, I will be what I will be. And at the same time, who was I? I was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. And so there's a sense in which God's ability to change and reveal goes both backward in time and also forward in time. God is awareness. God will change over time. God is whatever I need, different all the time. That's beautiful. Oh man, you are all writing such beautiful things. I can't read all of your comments, but I hope that you're reading all of each other's comments. So I'll just end on Monty's. It is not clear that changing is implied in Ehiyeh asher ehiyeh. Why do you say God is changing? Yeah, Monty, I think that that's fair. I think that there are different ways of understanding it. I understand, one way I am understanding, I think that you're right, that there are different ways that we can understand. I think I will be what I will be. One way of understanding that will be, it almost could be like a kid saying to a parent who's like rebuking the kid, and the kid's like, leave me alone, I'm gonna do what I want, I will be what I will be. There could be a sense of a sort of, you don't get to know me, I will be what I will be. There could be sort of that sense. I think I was understanding ehiyeh asher ehiyeh, one, because ehiyeh is from the word lihiyot, to be, and ehiyeh to me implies sort of a being that is continual and in the future tense, like almost a being that has not been decided. So like I will be, I don't quite know what I'm going to be, but then, yeah, I like, as Chris says it, God is unfolding to each of us in time. So Monty, I think that's fair to push back. I think there are different ways to understand. Part of what I'm trying to flesh out here is I think it's a cryptic answer. I will be what I will be. And I think that there's different ways that we might understand it. Okay, so you all have, I really want to thank all of you, and especially both for the comments I read and the comments that I didn't read. Again, please read each other's comments, but you have all already, even just in this phrase, this name, Ehiyeh Asher Yeh, I will be what I will be, you've actually sort of set out a lot of Hasidic principles, the idea that God is unfolding in time, that God unfolds to each of us, that we have a unique individual relationship, that God can contain multitudes, and yet God is all one. All of these things, I think, are really tenets of Chasidut. I want to now take this Ehiyeh Asher Yeh, and we're going to look at a commentary by Hasidic Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, he's in the 18th century. He has a collection of drashot, a collection of interpretations on each weekly Torah portion. And that book is called Kedushat Levi, the holiness of my heart. And so often Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev is called the Kedushat Levi. Oftentimes Hasidic thinkers are called after the names of his book. So this, what we're going to read, this comes from a drasha, from a Devar Torah of his, specifically on Pesach, from his book Kedushat Levi. Okay, so I'm going to read from a bit in the Hebrew, and maybe I'll translate and maybe I'll skip to the English, but you can read in whatever's comfortable. Od yavuar ehiyeh asher yeh, and so now it will also be explained what is meant by I will be what I will be. Ve'yavuar hatam lama nikra chag Pesach, and we'll also clarify why we call Pesach Pesach, which is like, you know, this is like if you are wanting extra Pesach Torah early, you can have it here. Dehine hakadosh baruch hu hotzi otanu mimitzrayim kedei shena'avod oto ukedei lekabel Torah kedusha, because the Holy One brought us out of Egypt in order that we would worship God and so that we could receive the Torah. K'moshe Amar, as it said, Ta'avdun et Elohim ala harazeh, as it said there, that you should worship God on that mountain, that's why God brought us out, so that we could serve God. Mehari'ui hayashu yikablu kodem et Torah, aval kadosh baruch hu dileg kabbalat Torah. V'zeh ehiyeh asher yeh l'shon atid. Okay, and he says the whole point of bringing us out of Egypt was so that we could serve God and receive the Torah. And so it would have been more appropriate that first we get the Torah, if that's the whole point of us worshiping God, first we get the Torah, and then God brings us out, right? If the whole point is that we're supposed to serve God, it makes sense to give us the Torah first, the tools through which we can worship God, and then bring us out. But God skips over that giving of the Torah. So the skips over is the language of Pesach, to skip over. He skips over the giving of the Torah, and that's what is meant by when God says, I will be, meaning in the future. At some point, you will receive it. At some point, I will be revealed to you. But at this moment, I'm skipping over that. Rather than give you the Torah now, I'm going to first bring you out, and then you're going to get it later down the line. V'hinei nehemar, and also it said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, asher hotzeti tcha me'eretz Mitzrayim. And when God introduces God's self, God says, I am the Lord your God that brought you out of Egypt. That's how God modifies God's self. I am the Lord your God. What God? The one that brought you out of Egypt. V'kasheh lama lo ne'emar asher bara shamayim va'aretz. And it's confusing, or it's difficult. Why didn't God introduce God's self as saying, I'm the Lord your God, the one that created the heavens of the earth? Wouldn't that have been a bigger claim for God, the one who created the whole world? Why does God say the sort of smaller thing, the one who brought you out of Egypt? Why doesn't God say, I am the God who created all the world? Hatirutzu, the answer is, Debe'etahu hayu mesigim et haborei baruch hu machmat shehotzi otam mimitzrayim. The reason is because at that time, the people were only relating and understanding God because the thing that they knew about God, the thing that they cared about God, was that this was the God that brought them out. And that the bringing them out of, the one who brought them out of Egypt, and the Torah and the Holy One, this is all one. And in the same way that they were only able to relate to the Creator as the one who brought them out of Egypt, meaning this is sort of profound, that we could only relate to God through the narrow lens of our own experience. We can't have this huge sort of understanding of God, because we're all so in our own world bubbles that the way in which we process and experience the world is only through the limited sphere of our own existence. So they didn't relate to God as the creator of the heavens, of the earth. That was too much. That was like too beyond them. They related to the God as their personal God that brought them out. And so in the same way that their understanding of God was limited by their own experience, so too their understanding of Torah would have been limited by what it meant to come out of Egypt. That had they been given Torah at that moment, it would have been a narrower understanding of Torah. Aval le'etid bimheira HaKadosh Baruch Hu ya'aseh lanu nisim v'niflaot ad ein mispar. But in the future, quickly, the Holy One will perform for us miracles and wonders without number. V'niyeh yicholim la'asig et haboreh Baruch Hu yoter mimele yasigu et haTorah yoter. And we'll be able to, once we've sort of in this future time when God has revealed God's self to us in all of these different ways, we'll have a much deeper ability to understand and relate to God, and so to a deeper understanding and a way to process and relate to Torah. V'zeh Torah chadasha me'iti tetzeh. And now he's quoting a verse from the book of Isaiah. There's a verse in the book of Isaiah that says, a new Torah will go forth from me, the me being from God. What is this new Torah that will go forth from God? It's the Torah that at some point will later be revealed when we have a more expansive understanding of our world and our own circumstances. Then the Torah, our own relationship to Torah, will continue to expand. That when the Torah was first revealed to us, we could only understand Torah through the narrowness of our own experience, the little that we knew. But actually, the more and more we know, sort of the further on in our lives that we are and in our relationship with God, the more expansive our understanding of God and the more expansive our understanding of Torah can be. So there's a sense in which it's as if a new Torah will go out from God. Okay, I think that I'm gonna stop there with this one and so just to sum it up and bring it home. And so what is Ehiyeh Asher Ehiyeh? I will be that which I will be. It is, as some of you were saying, it is this sense of continual revelation, a continuing deepening of Torah and deepening of a relationship with God, but it's from the perspective of our own ability to understand, which I think is just so true about human existence, is that we, even in our thinking about like politics, for example, the way that we take in information, we only take it in through the limits of our own, what we understand, our own information. We're sort of constantly processing things through our own mind, and that limits our own understanding of it. And so that's why God had to present God's self through what we would get. I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt. This is the bara shamayim va'aretz, the heavens and the earth, that's going to be beyond you. And so the hope is that as we become sort of more expansive in our thinking, that so too our understanding of Torah will be expansive, and we'll have newer and newer ways of relating to Torah. I think that this is a really powerful concept in the sense of an exciting and potentially dangerous concept in terms of halakha, Jewish law, continuing to evolve, because it seems to say Jewish law and halakha was created in specific circumstances, but actually the more and more we understand, there's the potential for a new Torah to come forth that will have a deeper understanding, and new circumstances will sort of allow a new Torah to come forth that might change the way we think about some things. So I want to pause here. I'd love to hear your thoughts and responses on what Ehiyeh Asher Ehiyeh, I will be, that I will be, what it means here, and really what the Kedusha Levi is teaching us about revelation. What are you taking from this text today? And so feel free just to put that into the chat. So Monty says, the more we know, the more expansive our understanding of God. But doesn't that suggest learning formal study is key? Yeah, that's a really good question, Monty, sorry. That's a very good question, Monty. I think that I was thinking that the more we know is not just about formal text learning. I think I was thinking about it more in terms of that halakha is created, that Jewish law is created within the confines of the time period in which it's created, and that sometimes new circumstances will present itself to us that will change how we understand and relate to Torah and change how we relate to God, and will necessitate the creation of a new Torah. So meaning that what we know is that what we knew in Egypt, it's not about book learning for me. What we knew in Egypt is we knew that we were slaves when we got brought out of Egypt. And what we know about the world that we live in today might necessitate a different kind of revelation of God's Torah based on sort of what we're seeing in the world around us. Rochelle says, and is God's revelation of her or his self dependent on our need for future redemption? I think, Rochelle, I want to understand your question better there. I think that it certainly is God's revelation is connected to our redemption, I think. That I think part of God revealing part of having that full revelation of God's self and our full understanding that does seem to be connected to being redeemed by God. Oh, so you read on, you continued. Okay, so let's read on the text a little bit. והנה לעתיד יהיה במהרה גם כן כך, מקודם יפדה אותנו קודש הבריחו, ויעשה עמנו ניסים ונפלאות. Okay, and so too, that God will first redeem us and perform for us all these wonders and miracles, and then we will have this new Torah. Yeah, so that you're right, that does seem to be that first there is this redemption, and then there is a coming forth of the Torah. That's interesting, because then it sort of places that God is in the driver's seat of it. I guess what I would say in response is, then that also gets into a really important theological conversation of who brings the redemption. Does God bring the redemption, or do we bring the redemption? How do we hasten redemption? I guess I would want to say, I don't love the idea of like waiting for God to bring redemption for this new Torah, new understanding to go forth, but that we also have a role in bringing the redemption and seeking out our own understanding. So my mom says, I can only learn at my own pace. You cannot teach me about physics if I do not have an understanding of basic science, right? Yeah, I love that there's a sense in which God is being a teacher here and saying, I'm going to give you what I think that you can handle at this time. I'm going to give you what you need to know. And then when you're ready for the next thing, you're going to let me know, and I'm going to know, and then I'm going to teach the next thing. The next thing will be revealed, but I'm going to take it based on sort of the step-by-steps of where you are in your relationship. Cynthia says, in the beginning of a relationship, you don't reveal your entire self to the other. It develops slowly so that it can be a fulfilling relationship. I love that, Cynthia. I think it's so beautiful. The idea that this is a beginning of a relationship. And so God is revealing parts of God's self that you have to take it slowly and build up to that. And what would it have been like if God had revealed everything all at once, that they couldn't have understood it? Maybe it would have been too much. I think that that's a beautiful idea of thinking about revelation as the beginning of a relationship. And what do you choose to reveal at the beginning, and over what time? Julie says, with more life experience each year, we read the same Torah differently. I love that, right? Because we keep coming back to the Torah. And so there's a sense of, thank God, deepening insights, new perspectives. Again, not about the more we know in book learning, but like we're different people in different times. And so there's a new Torah that comes forth in that way. God reveals pieces of God because we are not capable of deeper understandings. I don't agree with this. This diminishes us. I hear you. I don't know. I don't think that he's trying to diminish us. This feels real to me. It feels real that like we're human beings, and that I don't feel like, I'm not saying we are limited in our ability to understand in a way that like we're not capable of understanding, but it just feels really human that our ability to understand is affected by our own perception and the fact that we're in our heads all the time and our experiences in our mind. I mean, even in terms of aging, right? I think that what you understand when you're 5 versus 20 versus like 70 or 80 have more life experience. You just process and understand things differently. And that's not qualitative. You just have a different set of experience with which to process information. Okay, I'm going to stop reading your comments, not because they're not amazing, but because I want to learn a little bit more Torah with you. So again, I want to thank you for them and say, I hope you're reading each other's comments. So this was the Kedushat Levi on Ehiyeh Asher Yeh. I want to now look at another teaching with you. This comes from Rabbi Arthur Green, who I talked about a little bit earlier. So Rabbi Arthur Green, he's a rector of Hebrew College, still alive. I said 19th century, that's very untrue, very much still alive. So that is incorrect, please forgive me for that. This is from his book. He does a translation of the Hasidic master, the Sfat Emet, and that book is called The Language of Truth. Literally, the Sfat Emet is called after his book. the Sfat Emet means language of truth. So Rabbi Arthur Green has a translation of that book where he does excerpts of it to make it more accessible. So this comes from, it's really the Sfat Emet, but it's through Rabbi Arthur Green's translation of it. So he's talking about the moment in which God appears to Moshe, and the text tells us, in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush, that God appears in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So the Midrash says that this is to show that there is no place devoid of the divine presence, not even a thorn bush. So this is very Hasidic, right? The idea that God is everywhere and in every place, even that sometimes we think, or sometimes our experience of the world is like, where do we find God? Where do we have the most sort of spiritual experiences? Perhaps if you go out in nature and stand on a mountain, you'll feel really connected. Or if you're at like a beautiful lake, you'll feel really connected. But this is saying, why did God reveal God's self from this like small thorn bush and not from some beautiful mountain? Even Mount Sinai, there's a Midrash that talks about Mount Sinai was the lowest of all the mountains, that there were all these other grander mountains that God could have chosen to reveal the Torah, but God chose this like small stunty mountain in the middle. God chose the thorn bush in the midst of, God could have chosen some glorious forest. Why the thorn bush? Is to say, even the thorn bush, even this thing that you would just look aside, but you don't have this view where you're expecting to find God, even in the thorn bush, you can find God. So this just ties into the Hasidic idea that God is everywhere and the potential to experience God is in every moment. So the Sfat Emet then says, this is the purpose of exile. So in the Hebrew there, this is the purpose. The word for exile there is galut, which is going to be important. This is the purpose of exile, that Israel make visible God's kingdom, which is indeed everywhere. Which is to say, the reason why exile is important, this is like a major question, and this is good Pesach Torah. Why was it important that the Jews be sent down to Egypt to be enslaved and in exile for 400 years? Couldn't we have just skipped that? Or, exile after exile in Jewish history, why is exile important? Exile is such a fundamental part of the Jewish story. And it's to say that the purpose of exile is to teach us that just as God is with us in exile, so too God is with us when we are not in exile. That if we only encountered God when we were not in exile, we would think, oh, you can only find God when you are not in exile, when you are in the sanctuary, when you are in the specific place of holiness. But the fact that in this bush, in the middle of the wilderness, sort of in exile, that teaches us that if God can be found there, wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, that certainly God could be found everywhere, that we don't have an excuse for saying, oh, God can only be in this one specific holy place. But no, actually, God can be found everywhere. And the true meaning of the word galut, exile, is hit galut, revelation. And so now this is sort of amazing. The word for exile is galut, and you hear the similar sound. The word for revelation is hit galut. So even linguistically, there's a connection between these two words that almost have opposite meanings, between exile and revelation share the word galut. And so the question I would ask you just to be thinking about now as we're reading this text is, what is the relationship between exile and revelation? Why do they need to share the word galut? What do they share, exile and revelation? That the glory of God's kingdom be revealed in every place. This task is completed by the souls of Israel in this world, as the Midrash says on the verse, quoting from the book of the Song of Songs, I am asleep, but my heart awakes. The sound of my beloved knocking, open for me. This is a beautiful line. The idea here is, I think, I am asleep, but my heart wakes. The sound of my beloved knocking, open for me. He's going to begin sort of explaining this in the next idea, but the idea that even when we are asleep, even when we feel like we don't have access to God, or we're closed off to God, or closed off to the spiritual world, even though I am asleep, my heart is still waking, the sound of that knocking of someone trying to get in. The Blessed Holy One has chosen us and given us the Torah. The Torah is beyond time. Just as for the Holy One, past and future are all one. That sounds much like someone made that comment of, Eheyeh, I will be that which I will be, is both I was what I was and I am what I am, and all of that is one. So too, the past and future are all one. In that case, the choosing of Israel and their attachment to God that happened when Torah was given were already revealed to God beforehand as well. This powerful attachment to Torah, even though it was still hidden and unrealized by Israel, was still the sound of my beloved knocking, open for me. So quoting now from the Song of Songs, calling them to make this attachment real by opening as wide as an eye of a needle. So I think what he's trying to say here, and again, I think this feels very Hasidic to me, is that sometimes we feel distance from God. Sometimes we feel as if we are sleeping, but actually our heart is awake. And that implanted in us is this, he actually says it in the Hebrew here. Remember I was saying the word dvekut, so here. And this is the power of the cleaving of Torah, that there's a sense in which implanted in us, revealed in us, is this attachment and cleaving to Torah. And the question is, can we uncover that cleaving? Can we uncover that attachment and find a way for it to express itself, that even when we feel as if we're distant, that attachment is actually there? And the question is, can we make space for it? Holiness can be revealed in this world only through the opening that Israel makes, which is a really powerful idea. I think the idea here is that the holiness is there all the time. It's accessible all the time. But the question is, are we going to make space? Are we going to make an opening through which that holiness can come through? So there, it places a responsibility on human beings that God is doing God's part of making the holiness there and accessible. But do we make space for it? Do we do the work of opening our hearts up, of trying to, as the Hasidic masters would say, of trying to pour out our hearts to God, of trying to cleave to God? When we said, quoting from Exodus, we shall do and we shall listen. This is what we said when we received the Torah. We shall do and we shall listen. Noticing that order, that first we say, we're going to do it. And then only after the fact we say, we're going to try to understand and listen to what we just agreed to. We were making real the light of Torah, to which we were already attached somewhere deep within ourselves. This idea that first we had that attachment to Torah, and then only after the fact we try to understand it and unpack that attachment. But when we said we shall do and we shall listen, we were making real the light of Torah, which was already buried deep within us. Now that we have accepted the Torah, that is even clearer. The sound of Torah pounds in Israel's heart. I think the idea here is that, going back to the principles of Chasidut, that Torah can be accessible, that God can be accessed by anyone, anywhere. You don't need to be a Torah scholar. You don't need years of study. That this is saying the sound of Torah pounds in Israel's heart, that the Torah is within everyone, even the people who haven't studied it, even the people who feel they don't have access with it, that it's implanted in each of us. And it's just a matter of sort of giving our hearts over to God. Even though exile hides it, we need only long that it be revealed. Thus, it was in the Galut, it was in the exile of Egypt, that the Holy One, Nigle, was revealed. And again, he's playing with the language of that the root for exile is the same root for revealed. That it was only when we were in exile that God was revealed and redeemed them. It is of this that scripture says, as in the days when you came out of Egypt, I will show you wonders. Okay, a lot in that text. So with our last 10 minutes, I'd love to just hear your responses to this. What is this teaching us about Revelation? What do you think is the connection between exile and Revelation? So Julie says, yeah, the contrast between exile and Revelation resonates with earlier conversation about separation between holy and profane and God being everywhere. Yeah, Julie, that's really interesting, that it does feel like exile, by definition, we think about exile as a place or a time in which we are separated from something. And certainly we would think about God being absent in exile, that part of what it means to be in exile is to be separated from God. And what it seems like he's trying to say, and other Hasidic thinkers, is that it's actually in exile. We think that there's a separation there, but actually it is all one, that it's actually in exile that there can be that revelation. So that's interesting. You're right, Julie. There's simultaneously exile is the distinction, but then it's a bridging of that. Margaret says, exile is a form of deprivation and dislocation. So it creates need, space for newness, and receptivity to grace. Wow, Margaret, that's really beautiful. I feel like I need more time to think about that. This connects to a piece of Torah from the Mishnah, from Pirkei Avot, that says, Have goleh l'makom Torah. exile yourself to a place of Torah, which I just think is interesting that normally when we think of exile, quite rightly so, exile has such a negative connotation. Certainly we don't think about exile as something that we would seek out or derive benefit from. But the Mishnah there seems to be asserting that you should actively seek to exile yourself to a place of Torah in order to learn new Torah. So Margaret, this feels right on. Why would it be that the rabbis would tell us, Havei golel makom Torah, exile yourself to a place of Torah? Because as you're saying that, this exile creates a place of, it sort of creates a vulnerability, it creates a need, and that makes space for grace, as you're saying. I think that's a beautiful idea. Julie says, this world has the appearance of duality. The unity is hidden. Yeah, and I think that that feels very Hasidic, Julie, that could be what a lot of Hasidic thinkers are doing, is that we think everything is separate, and then the goal is to figure out that actually it's all one, that holy spark is in everything, both in objects and in people, in all people, even in good and evil, and to figure out what to do with the fact that the holy spark is in everything. Ria says, what do you think Torah in this context means? It seems to be more than the 5 books. Yeah, I think that you're right. So let's just look back. Where does he say Torah? V'zeh koach hadbikut shel Torah. Yeah, I think that you're right. I think that I was understanding it, Torah, it's really all things God, really all things that come from God, that the Torah is just one thing that comes from God, but this powerful attachment to Torah is, you're right, I think beyond the 5 books, but sort of an attachment to God itself. That's a good question of what it means there. So my mom says, I was thinking that when we are exiled, we have the time and peace to quiet down enough to think of and feel God's presence. Yeah, I think that that's a beautiful idea, that it's in exile that we have time and peace, that in exile, there's a sense in which we separate ourselves from all the distractions, from everything else that's around us, from all of our stuff, and we have space to feel other things. Marion says, place is less important than our intention. Rochelle says, exile is living in our own narrowness. Revelation requires our expansiveness and openness. I love that. I love that, Rochelle, because you're just saying that exile, it's not about, and this goes to the point before, that sometimes we think about exile as being about place and location. Exile is not just about place, that exile, we could be in exile in our own homes, right where we are, that what is exile is being in a place of narrowness, and revelations being in a place of expansiveness, and that could be happening right where we are. Okay, so Monty says, don't prophets tell us that we were exiled as punishment, and perhaps to be able to see the error of our ways and then really see meaning of Torah and God, new revelation? Yeah, is there a question there, Monty? That I think that you're right about all this. I mean, I think what's sort of interesting about exile is it holds both meanings, that both the exile is something that it is a punishment, and at the same time in other places it's something that we're supposed to actively seek out, that there could be a benefit of it. So yeah, I think that you've got it all in there. Yeah, Rita, I love this. COVID exiled us, so now we are studying Torah when we might not have been before. That there's a sense in which I like studying these texts about exile. What does it mean to exile ourselves to a place of Torah, to make ourselves vulnerable, to try out new situations, to push ourselves out of our comfort. But it always has the sense of going out of our homes. And there's a sense in COVID is like a reverse exile. Instead of exiling us out of our homes, COVID has exiled us into our homes. And as a result, we are having new experiences. So that I think that you're right, that Havei golel makom Torah, exile yourself to a place of Torah, that the place of Torah that we are exiled to is actually within our homes, but it's having that effect. So I think that's really interesting. Ari says, exile is part of the process of revelation. Revelation is ongoing, as in our understanding of God. Yeah, exile is part of the process of revelation. Revelation is ongoing as an understanding of God. Yeah. I mean, it's just so interesting that exile is so much a part of the Jewish story, exile after exile, even to the extent of now, the reason why we keep 2 days of the Chagim, like 2 days at the beginning of Passover, 2 nights of Seder, 2 days of Shavuot, it's because we're in the diaspora. But where it's like, okay, we can keep the calendar in the diaspora, because the idea is that in Israel, they for sure knew the right date, that they could get the right they knew what date the new moon was falling, so they had the right calendar date, so they knew exactly when the holiday should fall. But for the communities that was further out, before the days of the calendar, that were in the diaspora, that were in exile, the message might not get to them soon enough. It's a new month, this is the right date, it's the new holiday. And so we keep 2 days to hedge our bets of, well, maybe yesterday was a holiday, maybe today's the holiday. In our days, we certainly know what's the right date. We have calendars. So by maintaining 2 days, we maintain this idea that we are still in exile. So it's like the exile is built even in this moment in which no one is trying to return anywhere. We're in exile, which is to say that it's a really important part of our story. And so the question is why? And it's interesting then to tie exile into continued revelation. Okay. I appreciate these last comments. I'm not going to read them out loud, but I hope you are. I'm actually going to stop screen sharing now. And you have one more text on here that we're not going to read inside today, but I do encourage you to look at it if you want. It comes from Rabbi Nachman. And basically what he wants to talk about is that Torah is this undifferentiated light from God. That's just like light from God, but that each person, the way it enters that person, it can either be that how the person understands that Torah, understands that light, is dependent upon that person. And it could be understood for good, or it could be understood for bad, that the light itself is from pure, but our capacity for what we do with that Torah actually depends on the vessel, the people that hold that Torah, which I think is a really powerful idea. I'm going to pause here because I know that Ari always has some great thoughts at the end. And so let's actually have a couple of minutes to hear Ari's thoughts.
Well, this is like deep stuff. I hope everyone is taking it in. Sorry. I think what I appreciate is the writings that you share, and I urge people to read them and read them over. And I try to share stuff. I tried to share stuff last week, by the way, and I don't know whether it's the attachments, but Gmail knocked everything out. So I don't know if anybody got my attachments last week, but I tried to send them. So if you got them, just tell me. I'm interested to know. So we'll see what we share this week. But I think that what's great about this is just a different approach to Torah that we certainly in our modern world don't spend much time with, most of us. And I appreciate you bringing this to us. I know we're on the cusp now moving to 20th century theology and then feminist theology, which will be very different. So it's kind of a taste of different pieces of Jewish tradition. I think the beauty of the Hasidic world, and I'm a quarter Chabad, I guess I should say that way. My grandfather was in the Chabad world. And the beauty of the Chabad world is that they do, I think what's attractive to many people in the Hasidic world is this type of intense thinking about God and revelation and connection to God. And so I think you brought that to us, and I appreciate that. But it's also pretty intense and very much a challenge to modernity and how we think. So it's kind of it's nice to be exposed to it and to read about it and find meaning for all of us. I mean, I would say my most impressive thing is this group. I mean, you guys, you're all neo-Hasidic, whether you know it or not. You're neo-Hasidic. Like most of you, these comments are amazing and show depth, and I appreciate that. So that'd be what I would have to say today.
I agree. As always, I'm really grateful for your comments. You all bring so much to it, even through the chat. And I know it would just be even so much richer if I could actually hear more than a sentence from you. So I'm grateful for your voices through the chat.
So tell us what we're doing next week.
Next week, we're moving into theology. So for the rest of our sessions, for the next 3 weeks, we are still focusing on Revelation, but understanding how different thinkers understand Revelation and their different ways of responding it. So next week, we're going to be looking at major Jewish theologians responding to Revelation.
You know, one of our participants asked, what is Revelation? Because you just assumed Revelation, and we discussed it. Can you in like one sentence in 1 minute say what is Revelation, and then we'll go from there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm hoping that by the end of these 5 sessions, one of you will have the answer for me. I think Revelation can be, when I think of Revelation, I think it can mean a couple of things. I think I mean 2 things, but I think maybe I mean 3 things by it. One is God revealing God's self to Moshe, to Abraham, to us. So the experience of coming into relationship with God, I think could be a revelation. I think there's also the revelation of Torah. So sort of most classically or narrowly, it is the moment in the Torah of the lightning and thunder on Sinai and the booming voice, and Moshe comes down with the 10 commandments. That's in the revelation. So the revelation meaning the giving over of the Torah. And then part of what we're exploring now and will continue is actually a much more expansive understanding of revelation that is not just limited to God revealing God's self to Moshe in the bush or God giving over the Torah at Mount Sinai, but a revelation that might be ongoing, is personal, is unique. Is there a sense in which there's a revelation still going on today that God's presence is still being revealed or manifest in the world? And in what way is God being revealed in this world? Is Torah still being revealed? Is there a new Torah that's still going out? And how and in what way? So I think that that's really good to try to pin me down for a definition on revelation. And maybe we'll start next class by it. I'd love to hear your own thoughts on what revelation might be and what we mean by it. And then we'll see how they shift over the next few sessions.
So a lot to think about. Take your mind off other things that may be going on in your lives. And I do like the note from Rita about COVID bringing us a new revelation in Torah, because we would not be here. We have people from all around the country, and we have a teacher in DC and her mom. I don't know where Ivy is, but
New Jersey.
And her mom, New Jersey, and we have people with us from Maryland and all over Orange County. It's like a new revelation. This class is this whole process is a new revelation as well. So thank you for participating and learning, and enjoy the reading. We'll see you tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, some other time this week, and if not, see you next week. Happy Tuesday, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Sorry.
Bye. Bye.